Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on structured risk analysis in aerial work operations. I would like to give you an idea how to approach this topic of risk analysis. What we want to do is to understand how we can, when we start to write our manuals, our procedures, how we can approach this from a risk management point of view. This is what what I'd like to talk about. That's the agenda. We look at the types of operations that we're talking about. We look at the risk process overview, the risk analysis that we can perform before the operation, then the more specific analysis for a specific type of operation. Then at the beginning of the day, is there anything special during the day that we need to look at? Anything that happens during the mission, because it's work in progress, environment can change, so we need to analyze risks there as well. And then in order to improve everything, we need to have an information feedback and give you an outlook on what we can do. All right, so that's basically the structure, what we want to do. We have a chat. If you look on the left-hand side, there are areas where you can write questions if you have some. And feel free to add to that, and I will try to answer the questions also. If you want to ask a question verbally, you can actually open your microphone, ask me a question, and then I can get back to you. All right, good. So let's get started. What are we talking about? Well, basically, it's these types of operations that we're talking about. It's aerial work operations with helicopters or airplanes that are in close proximity of the ground, are in an exposed environment, or have any kind of special exposures associated with them. You know, it can be cloud seeding if you fly into thunderstorms, that type of thing. It's something that is not standard from that point of view. It's not an operation like from A to B, and let me see here. Okay. From A to B. So I think it's this type of operation that we need to look at. So when we look at risks and hazards, we're not just looking at the helicopter itself or the aircraft, but we're looking at a system. And I think it's important from a risk management point of view to actually open the horizon and see this as a system, because there are many things that actually have an influence on what we do in our day-to-day operation. Now, when we look at some of the areas, okay, well, there's first of all risks and safety. Of course, yeah, that makes sense. But you know, we have financials and leasing. What are the risks there? Production costs, procurement. Attitude towards the helicopter, international standards, how do they have an influence on us? Microeconomy, macroeconomy, that's something that we see right now. Network know-how, general costs and fees, those are all risks that we can look at that form part of the system helicopter that we have to incorporate into our thinking. Now, don't let this scare you, okay, because it seems very, very comprehensive. But I think when we start to work on these areas, what we see and what we discover is we can easily start in one area and then jump to the next area and complement that. We don't have to tackle and approach everything at the same time, but we can go step by step. And when we start to have this kind of risk mentality, risk perspective, we are able to identify these areas and then work on them. So we have, when we look at the system helicopter, a lot of things have to work in unison, and we have to identify where some areas could interlap, what dependencies are, and what could go wrong. Okay, so the whole system should be looked at. That's basically what I want to say. When we look at aerial work operations, when we're in close proximity to the ground, what we see is we have additional requirements. that come from the national labor security or work security laws, those are not incorporated into the aviation legislation. So again, we have to broaden our horizon and look at what are the requirements and potential risks that come from the national regulation on work safety. So this is something that we need to take into consideration as well. The dangerous goods part as well. When we do aerial work operations with off-airport landings, we might very well be in a situation where we have to transport dangerous goods that are outside the official aviation dangerous goods chain. What I mean is you don't have an official shipper that is signed off by ICAO. You don't have an area where you actually receive these goods and you check them, but it's much less complicated. So you have a truck with some gas bottles that arrive and they need to be transported to B. So basically, it's a different set of regulation that we have to look at when we work on the road, and also when we transport just fuel from our aerodrome to an off-airport area. That's part of the ADR, and that's something that we need to take into considerations as well. So we need to make sure that we look at the system helicopter and the different areas. Now, a lot of people obviously have already thought about this. The basic principles have been defined in ISO 31000. Basically what their perspective is, and that's interesting because it's different from the perspective that we usually have in aviation. It's the protection of value, and it's also the creation of value. That's a different perspective. But I think it's interesting to see the protection part is maybe something we want to have very high safety standards. Okay, well, that's one way of looking at it. But if we come from a protection point of view, we have something, we've built something, and we need to protect what we have built. That's also an interesting perspective. So when we look at creating and protecting value, or in this case also safety, we get a different point of view. Okay. Now, when you look at this, the right side here, you can see a safety management system or a risk hazard and risk analysis. It's basically based on these areas. It's integrated, it's structured and comprehensive, it's customized to what we do. It includes all the different areas. It's dynamic in a way that it can adapt. It uses the best available information, and it incorporates also human and cultural factors. Finally, it's continual improvement. Now, those are a lot of factors that we already have set into our safety management system, and also in continuous improvement, typically associated with management systems. But here we have this clear focus on value creation and protection, looking at these areas. Now, what does ISO tell us? Well, when you look at that on the right-hand side, when we go a bit closer, well, basically, it's not that different than what we do in aviation. It's a risk identification, risk analysis, evaluation, and treatment. So basically, the same steps that we do are also done in ISO 31000. And so this is where we can see how we can link these standards with what we do. And what is, in addition, what is not always part of the safety management system is the communication and consultation, scope, context, and criteria, and the recording and reporting. So that might have a different status in aviation. It's, however, always part of, it should be always part of what we do. Now, it's safety management and risk management should be an integral part in everything, not in everything, but in a lot of things that we do. What do I mean with that? Basically, what we need to, when we look at change or at a new operation, we should not just see the upside, but also potential risks. Obviously, it's great if we can get a big contract that gives us work for 3 years, but it requires 5 helicopters. It requires that many crews. It requires new types of operations. Okay, well, it's a great opportunity. There's a lot of upside for our company in that. However, we also have to look at, well, how do we get there? How do we make sure that our safe way of working can be transformed and upscaled to accommodate these new types of operations? What are the things that we don't know yet? And I think that perspective is pretty valuable when we look at new things and new types of operation. Now, one thing that is really important, safety management and risk management never stops. It's an iterative process. So basically, when you have done a whole thought process, you've implemented the changes, you reduced the risks, well, then you start anew. It's basically, as long as our environment changes, as long as the conditions within which we operate change, so does the risk management change. So we need to be open-minded and go back to these things again and again. There are various techniques. ISO lists, I think, 41 different risk analysis techniques for various subjects. They are proven to be valuable in one or more areas. So this is, if you have time to look at ISO, it's a really great collection of very good techniques. And some of them might not apply, might not be usable for your type of operations. But if you are open-minded and think about different ways of looking at risks, that might be something that could be quite helpful. Now, when we look at this here, we can see that there are different techniques for risk identification. So when we look at that, we have techniques for analyzing risk controls, the bow tie analysis, LOPO, whatever. I don't know all the abbreviations. But then we have, the B5 techniques for understanding consequence and likelihood. So we have event trees, we have cause and consequence analysis, stuff like that. We have techniques for analyzing dependencies and interactions. That's something that we don't really often look at, but it's something that we can, systems become more and more interdependent and more complex. So it's really interesting to see if we turn a screw here, what will happen over here. And there are techniques to do that. You can measure risk. The question that we face right now, what's the acceptable level of risk in aviation? That's a question that is very hard to answer and that not a lot of people have a clear idea about. What is acceptable? Is it, how do we measure risk? And then what's the level of risk that we're willing to accept? Obviously, we have these kind of statistical analysis. So for failure rates every 100,000 hours, things like that, that might be something, but it might not be inclusive, okay? So there's different types of techniques that could actually measure risk. Then we have techniques for recording and reporting, risk register, a lot of things have already been used. Bow tie can be used. So there's quite a few techniques there. Then for the risk evaluation part, we have the significance of the risks. And then we have like ALARP as low as reasonably possible, Pareto charts, risk indices. So that gives us some techniques as well. And then we need to be able to choose between different options. So when we have risk reduction option A and risk reduction option B, well, we have to evaluate which one is better, which one is more suitable to what we do. Techniques there as well. Then we have risk identification risks, scenario analysis, SWIFT checklists, cause and effect, the ICAO, the fishbone method, root cause analysis. So that's basically the things that you can look at. And then we also have techniques for eliciting views. So basically what we try to do here is we try to get information out of the people that we work with. Basically, one of the biggest issues is how do we identify the risks? How do we identify the risks that we currently don't know about? Are people out there that have a grasp on these risks and already mitigating them, working with them, but they have not communicated it? Typically that's one of the things that humans are really good at. So they learn about the risks, they implement the changes in their behavior, but then they're not able to say why they actually did that. They had probably had a bad experience or perceived the risk and said, oh, okay, now I need to change something. The same happens in our industry. So basically, if we perceive a risk, we work it out ad hoc and make sure that it doesn't really bother us anymore. But the problem is, it's not recorded. It's not looked at in detail. Could it have significant impact on other parts of the operation? And so we really need to be able to eliciting views. We need to get the information out into the open so we can actually work with it. So that's ISO 31000. If you look at what ICAO has written, they have come out last year with a new version of the safety management system, safety management manual, the SMM. It basically divides the whole process into 4 parts. The safety management system has 4 elements. It's hazard identification and prioritization, safety risk probability, severity, and tolerability. That's one part. And then we have the safety policy, communication, and safety assurance. We'll look at those as well. Now, the generic risk management process based on the latest ICAO guidance looks like this. Let's go through that a bit more in detail. It's actually, when you think about it, it's basically identical to what we've seen in the ISO part. It's these kind of steps. So we have a perceived safety concern right here. Sorry about that. We identify hazards and assess the risks. We have 2 perspectives. We have the level of severity on the one hand and the level of probability on the other hand. And that combination, severity and probability, gives us the level of risks. And then we have to define, is that acceptable? Yes or no? And then we actually go through this kind of ask, can we eliminate it? No. Can it be mitigated? Yes or no? Then, so that gives us this kind of thinking structure. Once we've identified and quantified the risk, we know what we can do with that. So basically, it's do not perform the operation. In a lot of situations, we have to say, well, we looked at the risks, but that's something that we cannot do. Okay. So again, you can see it's a loop. So it's not just about analyzing it one time. When you do the operation, well, then you continue operation, but then actually there has to be a feedback loop system where the results, if the operation and the evaluation that we did here is correct and actually works that way, needs to feed back into the system. So when we look at this part, it's important to see that it's not just the thinking that we do before and the manual writing that we do, but when we actually think about it, it's these risks, we need to look at them in each and every phase of our process that we do. And that means we perform an analyze before the operation, where we have time, where we can think about the worst possible thing that can happen. We write it down, and we think about how we can mitigate or reduce the risk that this will happen. We can also analyze the mission during the day before we get started. Okay, before we get started in the morning, has the weather significantly changed? Is there more wind? Things like that. And then we look at the risks during the day. Is the weather changing what we did not expect? Do we have additional pressure? Is material not there? Did something break that we did not expect? That type of thing. And then actually performing the operations, then we do have aeronautical decision-making principles. All right. So let's look at all of these steps in detail. Now, one thing that, I try to point out is, where should we look for risk? We have the system helicopter, one thing, but we also have new risk areas that we might not have thought about. And when we look at some of the things, some of the big drivers that will happen, okay, is, for example, changes in weather patterns, okay? That can lead to meteorological phenomena, catastrophes that we have to think about. It's not really about the actual type of operation that we do, but rather it's about, okay, how can we perform our operation in a changed environment? I think that's what it comes down to. How can we prepare for that? If we have extreme forest fires, is there something we can do about that? And thinking about these things. Now, in Switzerland, for example, it's April, but we actually haven't really any rain at all, almost. Okay, and it's already very, very dry. So these weather patterns will change. They will have an impact on the permafrost holding the mountains together. So we might have more rock slides. Is there any new operation that we might be able to be forced into that we need to do? Recovery, reconnaissance, delivering people, dry, water transport. What can we do? These type of things. So it's based on these facts that we have to think about what could happen. And then in more urban areas, we have to think about, well, how do we share the airspace? It's also about who is actually using and controlling the airspace. What kind of new technologies are there that we need to have actually so we can actually participate in the airspace? Remote controlled unmanned airspace called drones, these type of things. That's one thing, but it's only one thing. What about optimized communication? What about more dense urban areas that are used for more types of operation, more traffic? How do we deal with that? What do we need to look at? What are the potential risks, and how do we get involved in these groups that make decisions and proposals so we're not being left out? And then obviously drones, that's a big part. They actually are in some areas a direct competition to what we do in helicopter areas. Also for airplanes, when you look at imaging, drones are able to stay up much longer. If you have the larger drones, they have excellent camera equipment. For now, typically you have these kind of survey flights where you take pictures. Well, in the future, it's possible to have a drone up there for 12, 14 hours without any refueling. And that will change the way we look at aerial work and also what we have to do, what areas we need to get into and think about. All right. So those are just teasers for your ideas to think about that. So helicopters will have new roles in the changing environments. It's something that we need to think about and also be prepared to do that. But for each change, we need to look at risks and hazards, because when we get into change, things can go wrong. We cannot anticipate everything, but it's important that we think about these things beforehand. And when we do that, our type of operation will be safer. It will be more stable, and I think it will also be more resilient, because when we talk to our people about what could happen, they can think, they can have their feelers out there already, and they perceive things that we might not have looked at more easily, and prepare accordingly. All right, so let's now go through each step, what we can do. Obviously, you already know quite a lot of things about that that you already do in your operation. When we look at aerial work, we need to have some kind of model, some common model for our risk analysis. So we have this kind of framework that we can work with. That's a possible framework. It includes all different types of operations. It should actually encompass all the different types of aerial work, the operations there are. And when we use this kind of structure, we're able to separate certain areas and phases during the operation and look at them in isolation on what could go wrong there in that part, okay? So basically, for example, we have like a pickup area or preparation area. Then there's an overflight where we actually perform the operation, or we transport something and we drop something off, we return for another part, and then we depart again. That's a very simple model, but we can use it for basically all aerial work operations. Now, how then can we think about it more in detail? Now, when we look at all these areas, we can start to identify risk, for example, for the approach to a part, to an area, the departure, the overflight. Now, there's a lot of information already out there about hazard identification, and a lot of people have already thought about this. So we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but basically we can use this great material and use it and think about it, and then also enter and use it in our system. Now, once we have this kind of in-depth analysis, once we have the list and we go into the in-depth analysis of the hazards, and then once we have the mitigating measures, well, basically what we do now with the information package that we have, well, we develop a safety library, meaning we start to code, to label certain risks. And if we have a new type of operation, well, we can search for, give me all the issues that are associated with trees, or a logging operation. We try something new. Okay, well, then we already have everything that's to do with logging, and it should be much easier for us to analyze a new type of operation, because there's already something that we have and that gets us thinking into the right direction. Now then, what we do once we have the hazard identification done, we need to define targets and risk, safety targets and risk mitigating measures. Because, well, if we have a hazard, we need to identify what do we want to protect? Why do we want to protect this? Okay, why is this important? And that gives us a safety goal. Okay, so maybe if you work with helicopters and open doors, well, then you just basically say the safety target is not falling out of the helicopter, and therefore not dying, I guess. So, so that is important. So you have the safety target, and then you can look at and identify risk mitigating measures, like say safety belts, have a backup if you need to work close to the door. Maybe you have a safety harness and a hard point, these type of things. So once you have identified the risk mitigating measures, these points, what you've identified, that should then be an integral part of the description of the operation that you have. That's part of the operating manual or the standard operating procedure. So based on the risk analysis, you have also an idea how to manage the risks and reduce it. And that then is included into the SOP. And that's the process that you can see here. So general activity, just an example, all right? So you have, let's say, you stay outdoors, okay? Well, you have high temperatures, rain, wind, snow, okay? What's the potential damage? You can get frostbites, burn, sunburn, whatever, okay? Well, basically what you want to do, you want to prevent stress and minor illnesses. So you have proper protective equipment and you have known personal limits. Now, those parts, the action taken 1 and action taken 2, those are points that actually form parts of the SOP. That text is entered into your description. And I think that's why it's really important to think about these risks, because it's not just to think about them, but also to reduce them and then actually formalize it into the operating procedure. If you look at that image, the picture on the right-hand side, you can see that you integrate basically the risk analysis into the SOP. Sorry, that's wrong. Too fast. All right. So what you see, the risk assessment and the SOP writing is something that you do basically in parallel. So once you have the description, the risk evaluation, that feeds back into the script, to the description of the operations, how you want to do it. And then once you have your SOP completed, basically you should have looked at all the risks and identified the relevant risk mitigating measures. Now, one big issue with evaluating risks and then actually entering that into the SOP is the question, how far down the rabbit hole do you go? There's this kind of balance that you have to find between identifying the major risks and mitigating for them, but not over detailing the operation, because you can quickly get a very rigid framework that will not allow for any kind of deviations. I mean, if you say that's exactly how we do it and that's the only way how we do it, then in certain situations, that way might not be, or probably will not be, the right way for solving in that situation. And then you're stuck. So either you're not performing the operation, or the behavior or the SOP is actually wrong in that situation because it's so detailed. And you want to avoid that. I think that's really important. So find a balance between, describing the relevant elements, but don't go too deep, and leave enough room to make decisions and perceive risks on the go. Because you will see later on, well, there's risks associated with each day and with the operation, and we have to take that into consideration as well. So if we define everything in detail in the SOP, we will be lost. Okay. Now SOPs, that's your operational procedure where you detail. It's there. It should be there for your crew to use in the daily work. So checklists are good. Reminders, just heads up, stuff like that. Rules of engagement, these type of things. So it's something that people can look at and easily find an important element, even though they might know 80% or 90%. If they have an easy to use document where they just can quickly look, oh yeah, that's right, I forgot that. Good. All right, let's go now. So that's what this should be all about. Okay. It will help. It should basically tell you, it's like a recipe, a cookbook, when you open it up, and you should be able to know what to do and how to do the operation. Again, the level of detail we can talk about. On a side note, a side effect is the the training associated, because aerial work is just so varied. If you're able to trigger avalanches, that's one thing, but you might be really bad cutting trees. So for each type of aerial work operation, even though your company might do a lot of them, you have to identify, well, what is the competence or what is the skill level that a person, a pilot, a task specialist has to have in order to perform the operation safely, to be able to do his job in a safe, consistent way. And that is basically competency-based. So you define competencies that the person has to master, to obtain, and then you go and look at what you need to train. You observe the person, what they do now. You look at what they should know. You train them, and then once you have done that, you can check off and say, okay, yeah, he is able to put on the personal protective equipment himself correctly. So he doesn't put gloves on his ears or something like that, okay? So that's a different part. And also you can show the different complexity of an operation. So if you have film and photo flights, where you just fly above the terrain, that's less complex and less risky than wire stringing or shooting animals from the air. So those are two different things. Now, pilot and crew, they will have to have an opportunity to grow, to learn along the way. And so with a competency-based model, you can also classify the types of operation from simple to more complex, and then actually gradually build up the experience and the skill level of your people. And what you see here is just one possible way of dealing with that. Now, the presentation will be on a cloud server. I will post a link to the recording of this session, as well as a link to the documents that I've talked about to this presentation, so you're happy to use all of that. Okay, so now once we have the first step done, next step is preparation for a specific mission. Okay, so now what we do here is we actually, ideally, we go out and do preparation and scout. We look at the work area, the pickup, the drop-off, if we're performing sling load operations, or the area that we're going to fly over, that type of thing. And I think this is really important because it's a first set of information that you get from the operation. And typically you will do that scouting part with your partner, with the company or the person that actually requests the services from you. And that's a perfect, that serves multiple purposes. One of them is certainly to get all the information out on the operation. Also make sure that you clearly outline what you can and what you cannot do, and also already prepare the client for certain types of behavior that is expected for the operation. Because typically, lots of people get quite excited when there's a helicopter, you fly in an airplane, and they forget some basic risk or safety protection areas. So it's already a good start to do that. And also, it's really important to have a common understanding who does what and what needs to be prepared in what way, okay? When we look at accidents, we often see the problem that there was not proper communication. Some of the loads were not properly prepared. There were a lot of things lying around that should not have been lying around, that actually interfered with the operation. So when you have a clear briefing and you say, those are the rules that we have, those are the things that we need to do, well, then that's much easier. The client is able to prepare for that. And you're also able to check off the things that you need to do. Then you look at and you try to classify the pickup and a drop-off side. Now, that's just a structure that you can use. You classify the geographical features. then you look at the different approach and departure profiles. And based on these areas, for each area, there's different types of risks. So if you're in a confined area right here, like this, and then basically if you have enough room to do a steep approach, that already gives you more options. If you can only land vertically, then your options are limited, and there's different types of risks associated with that. The same goes then for the departure. So that already helps you to say, okay, that's a confined one side. We can only do a steep approach and a vertical departure. That gives the pilot and the crew that will actually be working on this a lot of information. So they're prepared. They know what they can expect. Then, you have to look at the different types of loads. Each load flies differently. We have to account for that. So if you know exactly what the load look like, how heavy they are, what their aerodynamic properties might be, that will give already a lot of information as well. Then try to set up a documentation for the crew. So basically, if you have a pickup and a drop-off side, let's look at it on that. All right, so basically we have our pickup side here and our drop-off side here. Now, if you're able to provide the crew with a map with all the obstacles, the cables in there, and some more information on the coordinates, the contact number, that will make their life so much easier, okay? They can already look at that. They can think about, okay, if I fly from here to here, okay, that's great, but where's the wind coming from? Now, in the morning, typically, the wind is flowing, depending on the time of day, you will have different wind systems in a valley. So sometimes he might have to do an approach from this side, and then a couple hours later, he might have to do an approach from this side. And he is already aware of the cables. He can look at and identify them, and then be prepared and look at his options before he's actually doing the type of operation. So that's a really important thing. Once you have the information, hand it over, okay? All right, so next step is step 3. That's the risk of the day, because every day will be different. And so sometimes there's more clouds, less clouds, there's wind, precipitation. All right, there's different types of people that we work with. That's where a FRAT comes in. A FRAT is a flight risk analysis tool. It's a very simple structured questionnaire that you can use to think about, okay, how do I feel? How much did I sleep? When's the last time that I did this type of operation? What about my team? Do we have any new people in there? Do they know what we are doing? Is there something that I need to look at in detail? And for all of these points, you have a risk value, and then you can identify the risks, the major risks, and you can also think about the risk mitigating system. So you either do a FRAT yourself, or there's there's apps out there that you can use that already use these predefined things. Now, and the final step is basically during the operation. So what do I mean with that? Well, obviously, when we said we have different wind systems in there, well, then depending on the wind, you might not be able to take as much load. Or if you have thermals, or if you have downdrafts, well, that will reduce your performance. It's all these things that happen during the day that you think about. Suddenly, there's a third party arriving at the place where you work, and they actually need to do something. So what does that mean? Well, then you just, the decide model is something that you could use in that. It's use aeronautical decision-making principles. That's, I think, the main message here. So use different tools for different things, different phases in the process. All right. And then the last thing is the flow of information. Now, you do all of these steps and all of these processes, but then also what's really important is that it will not get stuck there. So it needs to go back into the system. So especially if you do this kind of analysis during the day, you have to change something to mitigate the risks. It would be great if it would be possible to actually do that and send a short information back. If another crew comes to the same place tomorrow, they probably will have the same issues. How about, giving them a heads up and say, hey, we encountered this, so tomorrow look out. And then once it's in the system, it can be captured, it can be analyzed, it can be distributed. And that's, I think, what is really important here. This is a bottom-up flow, and then obviously, since once it's analyzed and decided on, it flows back down again. So this is also this cycle that needs to work. So write safety reports, please. If you see something, say something. It might not be that something happens right now or something dangerous is happening all the time. But over time, you kind of gain this kind of sixth sense or this kind of tingling feeling where you say, something is different, something is not right, okay? Well, then if you're able to identify what was not right, well, you can then describe it and mention it. And if it's just you, well, it might be an isolated experience, but actually if several things in the same area happen that are not leading to an accident yet, but you think about, well, if something would be different, we would have an accident, then I think it's really important for you to think about that and write about it. And the safety manager is then able to actually assemble and collect these information. And suddenly he has 5 or 6 similar reports about the same issue. And nothing happened so far, but he needs to think about, okay, well, we have 5 reports. Now we need to look at that. So it's not isolated. But if you don't report it, he never gets to that point where he can say, oh, we need to look at that a bit more in detail. All right? So your safety manager is actually managing the safety management system. As I already mentioned in the beginning, there's a safety policy, safety risk management. That's what we talked about today. Safety promotion, safety assurance. As you can see, it's 4 elements that need to be looked at and lived. I think this is really important that this becomes part of your company. Let me give you an outlook and then wrap up on this. All right. So take with you, please. It's the system helicopter. It's not just the operation itself, but we need to think bigger. Okay. National guidelines and laws about labor security and safety, they play an important role in SPO. Try to verify your safety analysis. Maybe you want to have a third party look at your analysis. Just an opinion, okay? Start to develop a safety library. It's really important that you actually structure the information you have so you can retrieve it later on. If you want to expand on the operation, look at what you already have done, okay, and then build upon that. Take with you, it's not done when you have a risk analysis and you write it in a procedure. There's more to that. Risks can be looked at before we actually start the operation. Risks can be looked at in the morning, before we actually perform and start up the helicopter. And we need to look at risks also during the operation. It would be great if we could have this kind of common system where everybody could enter the data outside of the official channels, because we typically only add accident and incident data. how about if we could actually enter safety reports in there, categorize them, and then enter them into the system so other people, even though it might be anonymized, but could actually think about, okay, our company B and C had the same issue. All right, well, great, because that could be an annual review. We can look at what other people, what other companies have experienced, and so we know we're not alone. That's one thing, and then also make sure that we're able to profit from that and look at, well, what were the major problems this year? Is this an industry thing, or is this just company A? And that gives us more information as well. So it would be great to have this kind of more wider safety management system with a safety library accessible for everyone. So that's something that we should be working on across the industry and make sure that we in the future have something like that. An industry-wide SMS. How about that? All right. So a lot of things are already there. I think that's something that we should strive for, because if you attach a load on the helicopter, typically a lot of risks are the same. If you're in Spain or if you're in Norway or Sweden, there will always obviously be several differences, but also a lot of things are in common. And how about if we could profit from each other, identify common issues, common problems, and think about how we can solve them. All right, so that was the idea. That was my presentation. Yeah, any question you have, you can write it in the chat. You can also shoot me an email later. So that's basically the way how to do structured risk analysis. All right, great. So it doesn't seem like there's something going on. So thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for your interest. And happy to answer any questions later on you may have. Thanks very much and have a good evening. Bye-bye.